Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Boozer. I'm with CUGC HQ. I'd like to welcome you to today's user share with the networking SIG. It's a big deep dive into NetScaler MAS. Just a quick overview of our format today. We'll have a presentation with a Q&A discussion. I'd like to remind you all to type your questions into the question panel of the GoToWebinar control panel off to the side, and they will get to the questions either as they come or after the presentation, however our presenters see fit. Also want to let you know that the presentation is being recorded and will be posted on mycugc.org shortly after today. And with that, I will hand things over to Dave Brett, our networking, one of our networking SIG leaders. And here you go, Dave.
There you go. Can you see that all right?
Yes.
Excellent. So welcome to the second networking CUGC networking SIG webinar. Just a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to go through some intros. We've got a guest presenter on today. Then we're going to dive into a bit of MAS architecture. With said guest presenter, I'll let him introduce himself in a minute. Then we're going to come back to me, do some stuff on monitoring and automation around MAS. Then Marius is going to deal with the integration with container orchestration environments. And then we're going to have a Q&A session. While either one of us, any one of us is presenting, the others are going to try their best to answer the chat questions in the window. If we don't get to your question during the webinar today, then we can, Marius is going to put a blog post out later on with all the Q&As, and we'll do our best to answer them as best we can. So, myself, my name's Dave Brett. I'm based in Liphook in the UK. I'm a Citrix CTA. A leader of the CUGC networking SIG, along with fellow CTA Marius and CTP Jason Samuel. I'm a technical blogger on bretty.me.uk and a community contributor on dabcc.com. Been working with NetScaler since about 2007, and I can be found on Twitter as @dbretty. And I'll hand over to Marius.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, my name is Marius Sandbu. I'm based in Norway. Worked primarily around Citrix and NetScaler for about last 5 years now, so I'm still fairly fresh. But my focus area is more based around Microsoft Azure and Citrix in general. I'm also a technical blogger and part of the SIG leader networking. And if you want to have any questions or anything else, you can contact me on Twitter or find me at my blog. And that's pretty much it. Carsten?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Carsten Bruns. I'm located in Germany. I'm also Citrix CTA, and also working with NetScaler since 2011. I'm blogging about it, and I'm doing some stuff about NetScaler and most of my time with Xen as well. Also the rest of the Citrix stuff. And if you have some questions, you can use my Twitter handle at Carsten Bruns, or you can reach me on my blog as well.
Okay, with that, I will hand over presenter to Carsten. And he can take over.
Okay, thank you, Dave. So, can you see my screen?
Yes, and Carsten, can I let you know, I had someone say that they couldn't hear you as well as everyone else.
Okay, so let's start with NetScaler MAS architecture and deployment. So first of all, let me introduce NetScaler MAS to you. So this is a platform designed by Citrix for monitoring NetScaler and automate NetScaler as well. So it's based on old stuff like Insight Center. Some of you will know it. And Citrix decided to integrate Command Center into NetScaler Insight Center and make a new platform which is called NetScaler MAS. It has most of the features from Insight Center and some features from Command Center and a lot of features more. Some will be introduced by Dave later on. I will talk about MAS in technical facts, in design, a little bit about traffic flow, data collection, and how to scale out NetScaler MAS for large enterprise use cases. So first of all, which platforms are supported? By now we have Xen Server and also Hyper-V, ESX, and KVM. Interesting points about the VM sizing is that you need a lot of CPU power for NetScaler MAS. It's based on the analysis which you do with NetScaler MAS. So the MAS server will need a lot of performance to get all the data in the database. Later on, I will explain the detailed architecture of NetScaler MAS. So Citrix recommended 8 vCPUs, 8 gig of RAM, and at least 500 gig of hard disk. For me, it will work also with 2 vCPU and 4 gig of RAM. This is only for POC working well or for very small infrastructures. So you have to decide on your own which size of NetScaler infrastructure do you have and which size should be your NetScaler MAS infrastructure. So in the last webinar, there was a lot of questions about licensing. So I will go a little bit deeper in licensing NetScaler MAS. It's not licensed like Command Center or Insight Center. It's a new licensing. So the first 30 vServer of all your NetScalers are for free. It's not longer depending on your NetScaler edition. It's all about your license in your MAS. If you want to add more vServers from your NetScaler, you have to buy additional licenses. The licenses are available in 100, 200, and 1,000 packages. There will be no single licenses. So if you want to use more than 30 vServers for analysis or for analytics, you have to buy some licenses. Important to know is that you can choose in your NetScaler MAS which vServer you want to manage and which vServer you want to analyze. So you can choose it in your graphic interface. So next of all, how is it working? The architecture about the MAS system. Short look under the hood. We have got some APIs. We have got the NetScaler MAS graphical user interface, which we will see later on in Dave's demo. And we have got also an orchestration system, so that you can use, for example, OctoBlue to automate your MAS infrastructure. So MAS is also like NetScaler based on Nitro service. So all your requests from your graphical user interface will go into the Nitro service to the management to the message bus, and this will translate your request into the subsystem. The subsystem are the detailed things you can measure in your NetScaler, the detailed things you can control your NetScaler, you can run your Stylebooks and also the data collector. Next to the subsystems, we have got a local data store. I will explain later on how you can scale out and how you can deploy single point of data store or multiple data stores as well. So this is the architecture of one NetScaler MAS system, and you can split it into different parts. Then you have got the instance plugins for NetScaler and NetScaler SD-WAN to connect to your NetScaler environment. So supported is NetScaler SDX, MPX, VPX, CPX, which we will see with Marius later on, and also the NetScaler SD-WAN. Sorry. So what will happen if you create a NetScaler instance on your MAS system? The MAS will poll the NetScaler instances in different types. So we have got these 8 different polling types. I will not explain every single because most of them are speaking for themselves. So we've got the analytics, which is the app flow traffic will be collected every minute, for example. So this is the data we will have our HDX inside or security inside or gateway inside and so on. And you can also do backups within your NetScaler MAS infrastructure, which will be automatically back up your NetScaler instances every 12 hours. And what's new, instead of using the command center, you can also deploy and poll SSL certificates, which will go on every 24 hours. The polling interval can be configured, most of them, not all. Instance polling, analytics, and so on. The first 3 will not be able to configure, but the other ones. If you add a NetScaler instance to your NetScaler MAS server, the following flow will happen. At first, the NetScaler MAS will locate your instance. The second one is that the NetScaler MAS will retrieve your license information. Be careful at this point. If your NetScaler isn't licensed with a standard enterprise or platinum license, it will not be able to be discovered in the MAS system. Afterwards, the MAS will add itself to the NetScaler instance as trap destination, so that the NetScaler will also get all SNMP traffic from the NetScaler instances. And the last point is that the NetScaler will request via Nitro to collect all the data from the instance to have the inventory. Let's come to the deployment modes. There are 2 different types. First of all, we have got a single server deployment. We have got all type all modes in one appliance. So you have got your database, your server system, your agent, and your connector on one system. And the next point, the next mode, will be the high availability deployment. I've got a screenshot for you. We have got a NetScaler load balancing before the NetScaler MAS systems. So you can use this for a high availability deployment if you have let's start again. If you need high availability for your MAS systems, you need to place a load balancer before it. So you will have two single servers which are deployed in a high availability setup, and that's it. And you've got a lot of installation methods for your NetScaler MAS. You've got the server. You can use this one, the first one, as a single server option, which means all is placed in one server. It's the agent, the database, the connector, and the server system in one single server. And the other methods are the agent, the database node, and the connector, which means that you have MAS agent servers which are connecting to your NetScalers, and you have database nodes which are storing the data, and you have got the connector nodes which are connecting between the agents and the MAS server. This is very important if you plan scale out scenario like this. So you've got your main data center, you've got a load balancer, you have your Citrix MAS server placed in the main data center. You have got your Citrix MAS agents which are connecting to the NetScaler instances, and you can place a lot of connectors which are separated from the databases. So in this deployment you will have 7 different NetScaler MAS servers which are connecting to, which are managing your NetScaler instances. And you can also deploy some NetScaler MAS agent in different data centers so that you only have one single point for the database, for the connectors, and you only need to deploy agents which are connecting to the server, and the data will be stored in the database via the connectors. So this will be a plan to scale out your MAS environment. And that's about the architecture. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I will answer them and hand over to Dave.
Right, did you, there you go.
Just give me 1 second. Got some problems with my...
Can you see that all right?
I can see it.
Yes. Yeah.
Is that all right? Yeah, you can see that. Good. Excellent. Thank you, Carsten. Appreciate that. So, as I mentioned earlier, my name's Dave Brett. I'm based in the UK, and I've been working with NetScaler since about 2007. Very excited about the MAS product. I think it can do a lot. I think it's a very good addition to the NetScaler stack. My part today, I'm going to walk you through some of the monitoring and automation capabilities of the MAS. first thing when you're deploying MAS for automation and monitoring is to ask yourself what exactly you want to see and what you want to be notified of. Once you've got this nailed down, then start looking at configuring the MAS to monitor that. Otherwise, it can get out of hand fairly quickly. What we try and achieve with MAS is a single pane of glass to see how and what your Citrix networking estate is doing, being that on premises or out in the cloud. So what I'm going to talk about today is upgrades, how MAS can help with that, how you can automate those, configuration jobs. These are what these are and how you can use them to simplify your NetScaler app deployments. Configuration change audit and ensuring that you have the right configuration down on your NetScalers. SSL monitoring is a big plus for MAS. Gives you an overall view of your SSL estate from one appliance. Event notification, how you can use events delivered into MAS from your Citrix networking estate and notify you of critical outages. And around the event monitoring, going to look at how we can integrate Octablue into that and take it a step further. And Stylebooks, we're going to take our first step into the minefield, that is the Stylebooks. So just one word of advice: if, like me, you have an on-premises network and a network in Azure linked with a site-to-site VPN, there's no native way to add routes to the MAS appliance. So to enable MAS to monitor my NetScalers that sit out in the cloud, I have to add a route to my MAS appliance, passing traffic for the 10 network to my RRAS server. To do this, log into the appliance, start a shell by typing shell, and then enter the command there, and that will add the ability to forward traffic from the MAS appliance out to your other networks. So moving on, upgrades. MAS offers you the ability to manage your upgrades across your Citrix network from a single place. You can push and install firmware upgrades to any of your NetScalers, either individually or all at the same time using instance groups. This reduces the administrative overhead in performing upgrades, as you don't need to log into each appliance in turn to upgrade. You can run it all from a central location. Fortunately, Citrix has been kind enough to make this process incredibly simple, albeit it wasn't that complicated before, but they've included a bundled maintenance task on the MAS to roll out the firmware upgrades. To get to this, it's under infrastructure and configuration, and then maintenance tasks on the MAS appliance, and then you literally grab your firmware file, pick the NetScalers you want to run it on, and then click go, and that's really all there is to it. So if I this is a demo of an upgrade. So as you can see here, there's two on-premises NetScalers, CUGC NSO1 and NSO2. They're both on my local subnet, and you can see here they're both running, so 69 is running 10.5 and 70 is also running the same firmware. So to upgrade that from MAS, you go down to config jobs, maintenance tasks, pick the upgrade NetScaler, then hit execute, and then that's going to let you choose your firmware image that you want to upgrade. In this case, I'm going to do 11.1.50.10, and then you pick the instances you want to run the upgrade on. This is where, if you had them defined, you could use instance groups where it will go to all NetScalers in a data center. So I'm going to do NS01, hit OK. That will upload the firmware and then kick off the upgrade on the appliance. You notice in the bottom it says monitor the tasks to see how the upgrade's going. To do that, you click on the NetScaler, click on the execution summary, and then you can see there that the instance log is in progress. And if you look at the command log, you can see the command that it's executing on the NetScaler at that particular point. One thing worth noting, if you switch to the NetScaler itself and look on the console, you're not going to see anything happening there until the reboot. Same as if you were doing it on the actual NetScaler itself. So you need to excuse me, refresh the command log until you see that the upgrade status has happened. So you can see there that's actually now installing the firmware onto the NetScaler itself. So now's a good time to switch to the NetScaler. And you can see in a second this will reboot once the upgrade has happened. There you go. So that's restarted. Switch back to MAS, go back to the execution summary and check the command history on your upgrade. And you'll see that all 3 commands have completed successfully, and it's verified that NetScaler has been upgraded. You can see the execution order of the jobs in here if you need to as well. So if we switch back to the NetScaler that we upgraded, that's now 11.1. And this NetScaler, if we refresh it, hasn't been touched. So that's still 10.5. So that's how MAS can help you with upgrades. So if we're moving on to configuration jobs. So I've long been a fan of configuration jobs on the MAS. They allow you to define specific jobs and run them against single or multiple NetScalers in parallel or sequenced. This, in my opinion, is a big plus for MAS, as it allows the IT admins to define specific jobs and give them to NetScaler consumers to deploy themselves should they wish. I did speak briefly about config jobs in our last SIG webinar, but I want to expand on what I spoke about a little bit today. You can find config jobs under the infrastructure tab again, and then under config jobs. Firstly, record and play. This is a big benefit for people who may not be familiar with the CLI or not know the SSH commands to execute on a NetScaler to do a specific task. So in essence, a config job is just a bunch of SSH commands that are going to run on a NetScaler that you push it to. One advantage is that you can make variables within these scripts to gather input from the user before you execute that on a NetScaler. So in the example on the screen there, it's going to ask the user for an IP address for a DNS server and a name for a DNS namespace. Getting those commands from a NetScaler can sometimes be difficult if you're not too sure about the SSH, and that's where record and play comes in. So if I show you a quick demo of record and play, you click on create a job and give it a name. So this is just a name for what you're going to perform on the NetScaler. From the configuration source, you drop down and select record and play, and then you pick the NetScaler instance that you want to do the configuration on. In this case, it's the one we upgraded earlier. You see there's no DNS suffix there and only one DNS server. So if we hit record, this is using SSO to sign on to that NetScaler, and it will present you with the GUI for the instance that you picked in the list. From here, you can go ahead and configure the NetScaler as you wanted using the GUI, which for a lot of people is how they prefer to configure NetScalers. Once you're finished with that, you just close the GUI down. And then hit stop. So what this is going to do, MAS is gathering all those SSH commands you executed on the NetScaler and putting them into a batch on the side here. You can drag that over to your config job pane, and it will display all the SSH commands you've ran on that NetScaler using the GUI. As I said earlier, to make a variable, you highlight the text. Just be careful that you don't get the white space at either side. Right-click on it, click Convert to Variable. The name is the actual variable name, so this is the programmatical name for the data that's going to be in that variable, and the display name is what it's going to ask the user for. So display name needs to be readable content. And then finally, if you want to save that as a reusable template that you can use over and over, click Save as a config template, put a name in it, and then hit Save. And you can see there that that's saved that. And then you can reuse that as many times as you want on any NetScaler you want to. So when you've got all your commands and they're ready and saved, then what? You need to deploy them to one or many NetScalers. So once you have your job commands and click Next, the NetScaler instances will give you select the instances that you want it to deploy it to. The execution mode you can either select now or later, depending if whether you want to execute it at that point or schedule it for a scheduled task. The on-command failure, you can roll back successful commands, which will roll back the entire deployment, stop the execution where it is, or ignore that and continue. You also have the ability to execute in parallel or in sequence, so one NetScaler after another, or if you've got 10, it will do it on all of them at the same time. If we look at config jobs and a demo of them, so you see these NetScalers have no DNS config on them, so I'm going to create a configuration job to add a DNS suffix and an additional DNS server to the NetScaler. In this instance, I'm not going to use record and play commands. I'm just going to enter them manually because I will be reusing this config job at a later date with configuration auditing. So you just type the two commands or the commands that you would want to execute on the NetScalers. Click Next. This is where you add the instances, so I'm going to run this on my two NetScalers in Azure and then my two on-premises NetScalers as well. Hit Next again. This is where if I had variables defined, it would ask the user for input for those variables. This is the on-command failure, so you can ignore and continue. I want to execute it now, and you also have the option to send an email report of the job to a defined distribution list. So if you can see that, that's now run that on all four NetScalers. If I want to see the status of that, you can click on it and hit Details, and then click Execution Summary, and click on any of the NetScalers and it will give you the command log, so each command is executed on that NetScaler. And if we switch to the NetScaler, you can see it's put the suffix and the name server in there that we've defined. So if I go back to config jobs and click create, I can create a new configuration job there. Type in the additional commands again. So with this config job, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it, rather than to execute now, I'm going to set it on a schedule. So I want this job to run at 1 AM every morning on the NetScalers on and off premises, and I want the jobs to ignore and continue in the event of a command failure. That's specifically done that if, for example, someone removes one of the DNS servers from the NetScaler but not the DNS suffix, it will fail on the suffix command but continue and re-enter the DNS server. So it's like a self-healing job. And you can see there that that's scheduled and that's going to recur daily at 1 AM in the morning. So moving on, configuration audit. I'm conscious I'm taking a little while, Marius. I'll try to speed up. It's a way to use MAS to ensure that specific defined configs are implemented across all your NetScalers. if you consider that config job we've just run, it's going to push a DNS server and a DNS suffix down to all of our NetScalers. What we want to now do is run a config audit against that every 12 hours to ensure that that config is actually in place on the NetScaler, and if it is, then mail us that all's clear or display a template violation. One thing on config audits, they will match commands you enter against the saved and the running config in the ns.conf file, so you need to be careful about your syntax. A quick example of that is add DNS name server and then an IP address, and add DNS name server with an IP address type UDP will effectively do the same thing on an NetScaler, but the ns.conf command is different, and if you have them different in your audit job and your ns.conf, the audit will fail. So if we have a quick look at a configuration audit demo, you can see there that there's a difference between the audit template we got defined and the running config on the NetScaler. So if I look at this, I'm running this against my Azure NetScalers and my on-premises ones, and they're the commands I want to see in the saved and the running config. You can see on the settings for config audit, it's going to email me if there's a failure in the, every time the config audit runs, sorry, it will email me and tell me the status of that. So I'm going to manually add everything onto all the NetScalers just to make sure it's there. So that's now done. So they've all got the DNS server and the name suffix on. This will naturally run every 12 hours, but you can force a poll. So you can force the config audit to run on demand. To do that, you click on the number of audits, hit action and then poll now, and that will force the MAS appliance to do a audit against the NetScalers and the template that you've got defined. What you'll see here is that there's now no difference between the running config and the template. When that refreshes, that's gone, and also there's no difference between the saved versus the running config. So that means on boot, that config is going to still be in place. You can see there's no config drift for the applicable servers, and there's no NetScaler audit template violations. So SSL monitoring, as I said earlier, MAS gives you the option to monitor all of your certificates in a single place. This is for all of the certificates installed on any imported NetScaler in the MAS appliance, and this happens out the box. So the dashboard you see when you go into the SSL monitoring pane is there without you having to do anything. Something that you can do is define trusted CAs that you want to trust. So for example, on the bottom on the left there, you can see I've put my internal CA as a trusted publisher. You can select your recommended signature algorithms or your key strengths. Set an email distribution list for the notification period, so 30 days before any of your certs expire, you'll get a nice email telling you. So you shouldn't get the whole issue where certificates expire on your services. Event notifications. So these allow you to pick any event that on any of your defined NetScalers and push an alert based on a rule for that event. These events can get very granular, and there's a load of detail on the NetScaler that you can specify. Just a word of warning, if you push out too many alerts, then people's inboxes get flooded and people tend to deal with those emails as spam as opposed to a legitimate alert. The event reporting screen will give you a nice overview of how your networking estate is working. If you want to see individual data centers, you can do that in the infrastructure tab, where you can hover over a data center and that will give you any current alerts within that DC. So if I look at a quick event notification rule, so clicking on event messages, these are all of the messages that NetScaler is pushing it back into MAS, any of the NetScalers that I've imported into this appliance. So I'm going to create a new rule, give it a descriptive name. So if my ticketing vServer fails, I want to know about it. Pick the severity that you want to monitor on. Scroll down, pick the instance that you want to monitor. In this example, it's my internal NetScaler. This is where you can get really granular. So it's the categories of failure on that vServer. You can or you don't have to define this. And then the one at the bottom there is picking the vServer you want to monitor. So I'm going to pick my ticket and authority. The action is I want to send an email alert, and I want to send that to my distribution list that I've defined. If I click create on that, you can see there that the alerts, the alert rules defined. These are current messages, as I said earlier. So if I switch over to my NetScaler and disable my ticketing server, that will mark the vServer as down, as you can see there, and that's fed that alert back into MAS, and you should see there that we've now got an alert, and that will have sent me an email based on that rule. So, taking that a step further, what I want to do now is integrate that into Octoblue so that the Slack channel that we use for our monitoring gets an alert when the ticket in vServer goes down, and also I personally get a text message so that I know about it. It's just an example of how you can integrate MAS into other Citrix products. So if I re-enable that vServer, and I'm going to just change the rule here so that rather than sending an email to myself, I'm going to send that to the Octoblue trigger. One of the good things that Octoblue can do is each trigger you define has a unique email address, so you can send an email to that trigger directly to trigger a IoT flow, and then base your actions on that flow. So if you look in this Octoblue flow here, you can see there's an email trigger there. So if I switch back to the NetScaler, go back to the same vServer or the same server, disable that. That's going to bring down the vServer and trigger an event alert on MAS, which should send an email out from the MAS appliance to my Octoblue trigger. So if you watch that Octoblue flow, that's now triggered. You can see the entry being put into the Slack channel using the NetScaler MAS bot, telling me the decoded what server is down and which server to validate. And you can also see on the left there, the Messages app on my Mac has got a text message telling me the service is down as well. So that's a brief example of how you can integrate MAS into other appliances, monitoring solutions. So, Stylebooks. Marius and I have spent a lot of time discussing these, and there are some things that we definitely agree on. I'm going to come to them a bit later. So, Stylebooks, they're YAML templates that you can use to create and manage complex NetScaler configurations. Citrix claim that they simplify the process. Whilst I think this is most definitely true with the inbuilt Stylebooks you get with the MAS appliance, I don't think it is always the case if you decide that you need to deploy a user-defined Stylebook. Again, we'll come to that later on. A single Stylebook can use to create multiple configurations. So these configurations are stored on config packs. So if you use a Stylebook to, for example, create a load balanced storefront service, that will get saved as a config pack on the MAS appliance and on the NetScaler that you've deployed that Stylebook to. So you can use the built-in ones, or as it says there, if you're brave enough, you can create your own. We'll have a quick look at using a built-in Stylebook to build a storefront vServer. So you can see there's nothing defined on the NetScaler at the moment. If you go to Applications, Configuration, and then Stylebooks, you can see all the Stylebooks that come shipped with a MAS appliance. If we look at the definition, that's the actual YAML that is deployed as part of that Stylebook. So if you want to deploy one, you hit Create New, pick the one you want to deploy. And then this is where it asks you for all your input based on the Stylebook. So we're building a storefront VIP. We give the VIP an IP address, and then you've got a port, a protocol. Obviously it's not being built to best practice. And then a backend server there, and then a backend server name. You'll notice there that the SSL cert settings are there at the bottom. We'll remove that from the custom one we do in a minute. Pick the NetScaler you want to deploy this on, and this is where you can do a dry run. So if you put dry run and create, it will show you what it's going to create on those NetScalers, on the one or more that you selected. Once you're happy with that, take the tick out of that, hit create. MAS will then go away and apply that Stylebook to any of the NetScalers that you selected, and you see there it's been applied. You can view the objects created directly from MAS. If you switch over to the NetScaler itself, you can see it's created the VIP there. So we quickly test that that's live. There it is. So say you want to back out that Stylebook, literally delete it from MAS. That will then run the commands to remove that Stylebook and the definition that you've defined from the NetScaler. So if we switch back over to that, then you can see that's gone. So user-defined Stylebooks. This is where Marius and I agree on a lot of things. If we run through some of them, one thing, it does need more documentation surrounding Stylebooks. There's not a lot out there, and finding it is very difficult. You need to know where to look for them and or edit the ones that come with the MAS appliance. Now, sure, as this product matures, then more of that will go out there. Because it's YAML, don't use tab. If the YAML requires proper indentation, so if you use the tab to indent your YAML Stylebooks, then the compilation of that Stylebook is going to fail. You do need a good working knowledge of YAML and Nitro. I'll demonstrate this later, but there are direct relations between the YAML config that you define and the Nitro APIs. It is case sensitive, so be aware of your variable names. For example, there's two examples there that the case is a issue. Use Notepad++ or something for your development environment that can decode YAML. It will make your life a lot easier, and use YAML-lint.com to validate the Stylebook prior to uploading it to your MAS. So a Stylebook comes with 6 sections in there. The header, this is mandatory. It's going to define the identity and what the Stylebook will do. The import Stylebooks, this is where you can import other Stylebooks or Nitro config Stylebooks, and that's also a mandatory field. Parameters, this is optional, and it allows you to define the parameters you want to use in your Stylebook and gather from user input. Components, this is like the core of the Stylebook. This section lets you define the entities that are going to be created as part of the Stylebook. You can create a component section without a parameter section. Outputs, this is also optional, and this lets you define the components of the Stylebook that you want to expose to your users. And operations, again, this is optional, and this lets you define analytics in MAS for any vServer in the Stylebook. So if we take a quick look at a user-defined Stylebook. Now, I can't take credit for writing this, but Marius, the YAML Jedi, as he likes to be known, wrote this. In the true sense of the networking SIG, and the community gave me his Stylebook for use in this section. That's what he really looks like. This has not only saved me a lot of time, but has also probably saved the spacebar on my Mac at the same time. If you look at his Stylebook there, you can see he's using 5 of the 6 sections. You have the header section there, the import stylebooks, the parameters. This is the components, which is the core of the stylebook, and then the outputs that he wants to expose. As I said earlier, the components part is the core of the stylebook, and the reason you need to know YAML and Nitro, if you look on the left there, is the Nitro documentation. You can see there's a section called LBV server, and the properties of that are name, service type, IP46, and so on and so forth. And then if you look on the right here, this is the YAML in the stylebook, and the LBV server is right there, and all the properties are exactly the same as in Nitro. You'll also notice there's question marks at the end of some of the parameters. These hide the values within those parameters from the user under an advanced twisty when you're deploying them. So if we look at the YAML Jedi stylebook being deployed, we look at the NetScaler again. There's nothing deployed there. Then if we go into Stylebooks, we can import the stylebook. If we paste that in there, this is based on the load balancer, but we wanted to strip out the certificates and put some custom entries under the advanced tab. So if you look there, that's been imported, so you can create a new deployment and pick the stylebook you've just imported into MAS. This again will ask you for the vServer name based on the other vServer, the IP address of the server that's fronting that vServer. You can see there that we pushed some entries into the advanced properties using the components area. This is the backend server, it'll be the same one as before. This will be the app server's FQDN, and then if you scroll down you'll notice there's no certificate option for the user to select now. If we pick the NetScaler we want to deploy it on, click create, and that's going to go away and push that stylebook that we've imported, which is the user defined one, to the NetScaler. If we switch across to that we can see that it's there. Then to remove it is exactly the same as beforehand. So you just remove that from the MAS and that will execute the commands on the NetScaler to remove that. And with that, it brings me to the end of my monitoring and automation part. Sorry, it overran a little, and I will hand you over to Marius to carry on with containers.
Thanks, Dave. That picture is going to give me nightmares for the next couple of weeks, most likely.
Hope so, mate.
So just give me a heads up when you can see the presentation, so I can get started.
All good.
Good. Yeah, so as I mentioned, my name is Marius, and today I'm going to talk about container orchestration, and in this case, it's going to be the CPX and MAS. So I talked briefly about the CPX in the previous SIG webinar, and talked a little bit about containers as a whole, and what I've seen the last couple of months, there hasn't been a lot of interest around CPX. And also last night I took a quick look into the Citrix forum. So as of now, there's no activity on the Citrix forum for CPX. So there's two ways to interpret it: either there's no interest on CPX, or that people aren't sure where to start and what to look at and so on. So I'm gonna try again to take or talk a little bit brief again what containers is, a little bit about the life cycle and container management and what microservices are, and then I'm going to go more into where the CPX fits into a container environment, how to get started, talk a little bit briefly about the different platforms that we have, and how we can integrate CPX and MAS into those environments. And also some additional topics around Nitrox, which is also an open source Citrix tool, and some other additional features as well. So just to recap and start and talk a little bit what a container actually is. So a few years back, when I just started my or should I say journey into containers. I was kind of like Woody in Toy Story. Wasn't aware what containers were, and I had a coworker which was really into DevOps and containers and microservices and so on. So it's kind of hard to navigate into the jungle, but just going to try my best and describe the differences between a virtual machine and a container, because that's often the easiest way people can compare the two differences. So with a virtual machine, we have a hypervisor installed on a physical hardware. We have a set of resources defined or defined to an instance. So we specify CPU, memory, disk, and so on. And then we install an operating system, guest operating system on top, and then we add additional services on top of it. So for instance, the NetScaler VPX is a virtual machine. But the problem is here that we have a lot of overhead going away installing multiple guest operating systems. So with containers, what we actually in essence have is that we have a operating system which supports containers, which can be Linux or Windows Server 2016. And then we're going to isolate or slice up the operating system into multiple instances, which has their own networking stack. So each container has its own IP, its own namespace, own separated file system, and registry, and so on. So in this case, we have, for instance, let's say an Ubuntu 14.04 Docker host. And then we can have multiple containers running on top of it, so it's leveraging the underlying operating system, but still an isolated instance. So we can have, for instance, the MySQL container, Apache or Nginx container running, and also we can have a NetScaler CPX running as well as a separate container with its own IP and so on. So when you start running into containers and talking about DevOps, there's a lot of different tools involved. From a developer perspective, which when I was younger, I used to look at developers kind of like Neo in Matrix. They develop software, they commit the code to GitHub or some form of repository, and you might have Jenkins or some other tool which picks up the source code and creates a container image based upon the code. Or you can have Jenkins to pull Docker images from an official repository like Docker Hub, for instance, and can push the image to our private repository. And then we can have Docker starting containers based upon those images, which can either be used for quality testing, staging, and even production. And the main idea here is that developers can do continuous development and making updates a lot faster than they could with old-fashioned monolithic systems, and leveraging what we like to know as microservices. So with microservices, we try to split up a system into smaller modules running individually in its own or multiple containers. So we can have a simple microservice setup. And if we look at, for instance, Twitter or Netflix, they're running the entire stack mostly on containers and different types of tools which actually automate the entire build process for each of their service. So I like the reference with Star Wars. It fits pretty nicely in with my Death Star reference here. So what does the CPX provide? It's kind of like a mini NetScaler. It has layer 4 to layer 7 load balancing. We can do content switching, SSL offloading. We can do rewrite and responder policies. It also supports AppFlow for Web Insight. So we don't have ACA proxy, we don't have GSLB, and we cannot set up an HA pair, for instance. So there's some limitations there compared to a regular instance. It comes in two flavors. You have free edition or license, which defines how much bandwidth and SSL transactions it can provide per second. So if you want to get started with a CPX, simplest way, if you have a supported Docker host, which is currently Ubuntu 14.04 and above, I believe, you can just go in and download from CLI using the wget command from Amazon. So this is the free version. And after you downloaded the zip file, you need to import it into the local Docker repository. So you can just do a Docker load and import it, and point it to the compressed file. And then you need to start a container. And first, and some of the things you need to be aware of is that when you run or specify, start a container, to specify which ports on the container you want to publish externally on the Docker host. So in this instance, we want to publish port 2280, 161 on the CPX instance externally on the Docker host, so we can use SSH directly to the CPX and use Nitro against the CPX and so on. And of course, there's a newer version available from Citrix. I believe it's 50.10 now. So you could do a upgrade directly within Docker when you get the latest image. So when you do a Docker run command, you can, for instance, do CPX dash and then specify the image name, or you can specify CPX dash latest to start a container based upon the latest image. Yeah, and also remember that the CPX is stateless, like all containers. They don't have any persistent storage. So if you CPX instance reboots, or you stop the container, kill it, and restart it again, all the configuration is lost. So you need to either have MAS or some form of automated deployment if you want to use it properly. So when you deploy a CPX instance, it can specify the different ports. You get a set of default ports that you can use. So if you use the docker ps command, you get a list of running containers and what kind of ports which are mapped to it. And these are the ports you need to use if you want to leverage Nitro or SSH. So by default, if you want to use SSH into the CPX instance, the default username and password is root and Linux. And then for Nitro, you still have the default nosroot credentials. If you want to use SSH into the CPX instance and run commands directly into the command line, you need to use the command wrapping or use the command wrapper script first. You just type CLI_script and then you type the NetScaler command you want to run. But as I mentioned, not all features are supported on the CPX, so it might be that not all commands are going to work properly. So when it comes to deployment options, just from a standalone CPX perspective, you can use it locally on developers' own workstation, for instance. You install Docker locally. You set up a bunch of web containers, for instance, using Nginx or Apache. And then the developer can also install CPX as its own container and set up load balancing to do test and dev and so on. So if you want to move this into a more production environment, you can have where you have multiple Docker hosts set up with multiple containers running of different sorts. You have a CPX instance which is going to do load balancing locally on the Docker host. So in this case, you might have, for instance, a web service running, which is externally published on the Docker host using port 22123, for instance. And then you have a vServer set up on the VPX or an MPX, which points to a service group which consists of the different CPX instances. So when it comes to container platforms, we need to have some form of framework in order to manage all the different steps of a container lifecycle. So for instance, handling the image repository, setting up fault domains, and specifying that if you want to set up a container, it needs to be spun up in different racks, different data centers, and so on. We need to have some form of overlay traffic so we can have cross-host communication and specify, as I said, containers are stateless, so we need to have some form of persistent storage mechanism in place, reporting, and so on. So this is, as I mentioned, some navigating through the jungle. There's a lot of different options available here. So you have Kubernetes, you have Rancher, Docker Swarm, and Docker Data Center, Mesos and Marathon for and so on. There's a lot of different options available here, and also most of them have different ways to do different things, like doing the overlay traffic, for instance, in the back. But I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. But most of the container platforms actually come with a pre-built load balancing solution based upon HA proxy. So which is in most of the different, for instance, Rancher, you can go in and configure HA proxy directly from within the UI. So this is trying to make a visual drawing to just do a brief summary of what a container networking should look like, or could look like, if you have different platforms available. So as I said, you have container hosts using some form of operating system. And you have overlay network. You have different vendors here. You have Flanell, Open vSwitch, Calico, Roman, and so on. Some of them use, for instance, VXLAN to do cross-host communication. Some of them uses IPsec, BGP, and so on. But the main thing I want to talk about here is the service discovery component. So the main idea behind containers is that you spin up and spin down when it comes to new version. So there's a lot of updates happening all the time, and most of the container platforms have some form of service discovery and service registry component. So when a container spins up, which is attached to, for instance, let's say the front end service, it's gonna notify the service registry component, says, hey, okay, I'm up now, I'm running on this IP and this port, you need to add me to that service. So that way the cluster manager can have a list of all the endpoints and update the ingress or load balancer that it has available. So when your request comes in from a end customer or user, it gets redirected to the new containers that are spun up. So where does CPX and MAS fit into the picture? CPX actually integrates directly to the service discovery framework using CPX controller. And here we have two options. We can either have the NetScaler MAS, which Dave and Carsten talked about, or we can use something called Nitrox. So Nitrox is an open source tool from Citrix. It's only intended for development purposes, but its only job is to act as a CPX controller for the service discovery framework. But with, for instance, MAS, we have a lot more options available. You can use it to manage CPX instances using the Docker Remote API. We can use it to deploy additional CPX instances. We can do management, SSL management, Stylebooks, log management, app flow collection, and so on. So there's a lot more functionality available in MAS. But in terms of integration directly with a container platform, MAS can integrate, as of now, with Mesos and Marathon, while Nitrox can integrate with Consult, Kuberbetes, Mesos, and Docker Swarm. So it depends what kind of container platform you use or what you want to leverage. So Nitrox can be found now on the Citrix GitHub repository. There's also some other free components available there as well. So Citrix is actually working on creating a Kubernetes ingress component using regular NetScaler, so VPX or MPX, where it integrates directly into the VXLAN overlay and access a load balancer directly. And they're also creating a Terraform provider. So Terraform is a component used to provision infrastructure. So they have an own provider now for NetScaler as well. So moving back to the service side discovery feature. So if we insert CPX and a MAS into the picture that we had previously, what's going to happen is that when an update occurs, so let's say we spin up additional containers, it's going to notify the service registry component, and then the service discovery component is going to notify the CPX controller, which could either be MAS or Nitrox, or Nitrox and MAS is going to query the service discovery component to get a list of updates. And when what it's going to do is going to update the service group which is attached to that particular, let's say, front-end service with all the new endpoints or new containers which is added to the list. So this is what it looks like from an overview or architecture perspective. So we spin up, let's say, 3 or 4 new blue instances of the container. It's going to register themselves with the service discovery component, which is then going to notify Nitrox and MAS, and they're going to update the service group to update the load balanced vServer. So if we don't have a CPX controller or we can't leverage it using our existing container platform, we have another option. We can use the REST API proxy. So we can create a Nitro API script, which will then talk to MAS and then will redirect the different jobs to the different instances. So that could be CPX or regular NetScaler like VPX, MPX, for instance. The only thing that you need to be aware of is that instances needs to be added to MAS before we can leverage this feature. But again, we can then use scripts automatically to multiple instances at the same time. Or if Dave said, if we're brave enough, we can use Stylebooks, or we can use configuration jobs, which can also target a CPX instance. So this is just an example of how to use the REST API proxy. So if you want to try this out or learn more about the Nitro API, I suggest you download a tool called Postman, which is the easiest way to test it out. So what actually is happening when you need to specify an authentication script first. You log into the MAS using its IP address and specify Nitro v1 config login with the username and the password that you have. And after you've logged in, you'll get a response, and you need to copy out the session ID because that's the unique session ID that you have, which will then be leveraged when you do the configuration later on. So if you want to, let's say, configure a sample load balancer, or sample load balance virtual server, you need to specify the session ID into the HTTP header. You need to specify the managed instance IP, so meaning the target you want to run the script against. And then you need to specify the content, the name of the virtual server, service type, and so on. So this is basically just the Nitro API commands. So, as I said, CPX and MAS, a lot of functionality added in so far, but still there's a long road ahead. And I tried talking to the product management team and get some information about what's coming, but I didn't get any information before the webinars. But there's a lot of stuff coming out, I'm guessing next year. If you're interested in interacting with product management and different developers, I suggest you join the Slack channel. There's an old Slack channel for CPX. So just go into microloadbalancer.com/community/Slack. So you can get an invite there directly. So now we've just gotten to the end of the webinar. Just want to mention some additional things you should sign up for. There's of course the NetScaler Masterclass, which is first week of every month. And for some reason the presentation just decided to drop out. There we go. And of course, sign up for the Networking SIG forum. You can talk directly to some of the product managers and of course some of the guys from Citrix Consulting. And of course, we have our own Slack channel, netscalerrockslack.com. So if you're interested, just sign up, or you can just post your email address in the window or send it privately to us afterwards and we can give you an invite. So are there any questions which remain unanswered?
There's quite a few, Marius. I think we're going to have to get the list from Stephanie post webinar and get a post up online, I think.
Yeah, we've tried to answer as many questions as we can, but I see there's still some unanswered, and we'll, as I said, try to get them posted on the SIG website. So we're gonna get a list of all the questions and try to answer all that we can. But if there aren't any further questions, I thank you for your time. I guess we spent all the time that we have.
And I just want to let everyone know I threw a link in the chat window for you to join the Networking SIG if you haven't already, and that's another place that you can ask more questions if you didn't ask them today. And we also like to have you guys fill out a survey about our webinars. That helps us plan all of our future content. So it doesn't take long at all, and it's completely anonymous. And guys, do you have anything else you want to add before we close out?
No, just want to say everyone for taking the time to come in, and of course, if you guys want to hear about specific topics or subjects within NetScaler or network in general, I would highly appreciate if you just give us some feedback on what you want to hear more about.
Yeah, I'll second that. And also, if there's any of you that want to present or get involved in any of these webinars, then drop Jason, Marius, or myself a tweet or an email, or just post something on the networking SIG and we can get something arranged.
All right. Well, thank you guys. We really appreciate you doing such an in-depth presentation today, and looking forward to more to come. All right, everybody have a great day. We'll see you at mycugc.org.